During the last exercise, you have already exported a configuration, and right now we're getting a little bit deeper into what you actually did, configuring application settings. And this is what we configure through the user interface. Now, in the user interface, we have various options to configure applications within Liferay. And that is, well, basically, if you add a portlet, a widget to the page, you can configure it. If you just have the widget available, you can configure it to basically expect a certain default setting. So on a site level, on an instance, or on a system-wide level. And day to day, you won't really configure the applications themselves, but you got to be aware that this option is here. And just like you would do with the document library, you might want to export the settings from one of your servers and bring them onto, import them onto another server. Either you or you want to make that available. For example, embed it in a Docker image so that you can run it elsewhere. Now, the application suites have their own, or each of the application suites has their own configuration. The web experience management, as it says here, just is our content management system, as I like to say, has a few other options, not just web content articles, but navigation, search is in there. We have collaboration tools, we have business productivity tools where you can configure things like the workflow. And all in all, the level that I want to discuss in this training is more or less the system global level, where we set certain defaults, where we set something that applies to almost everyone on the system. LDAP is something that we will configure a little bit later. And right now, we can actually look at things like the system settings, default configuration for all sites, and default configuration for applications, where we just have the global defaults for them. When you do so, again, where do you do that? Control panel, configuration, and then system settings. So this is the configuration which you can export as well. You go in, see what you can configure with help text, and then you can click export. Well, export, where is that? Let's quickly go on here. Control panels here. I could have checked it by myself. There we are on system settings. Any of the settings that you make here can be exported. For example, you can export all of the settings right up here in this little kebab menu, which many people just miss. So just top right, always pay attention to this little menu. If you are in control panel, there might be valuable operations that you otherwise miss. And if I go to, for example, let's say the documents and media configuration here, then this is where you configured your MIME types, and once you have saved it, it will no longer say that this configuration was not saved, and you can safely export it, which means if I change anything here, long setting, so I'm just inventing my new MIME type here, saving them, and now I can actually export these settings right here. I can export it, which results in a .config file, which is a file that I can also just manually edit. I can save it, and I can deploy it to an external system, to any other system. So let me just show what we get here by opening it with a text editor. Here we are. Okay, this editor can't increase the font size. Basically, this is the configuration that I have just made, and you can see with a proper text editor, you can also edit it yourself. My recommendation is to always start with this properly exported file, and then, well, it's up to you if you edit through the user interface or through this file. Now, when you look at the name of the file, com.liferay.document.library.configuration.dlconfiguration.config, the name is relevant. So you gotta preserve that name and use exactly this name for this configuration if you deploy it to another system, because that is the key to where Liferay actually makes use of this configuration. And that's why, well, that's another reason why you typically start with an exported version, because why would we want to look that long name up if we can just configure, download, and then we have the correct name that Liferay's implementation generates from exactly that value. Continuing on the config files, you can deploy them in any instance of the same version. You can distribute, you can distribute the settings through many instances, for example, through copying a config file into Liferay's OSGI configs folder. Now, this is a folder that I believe our image has already extracted into a volume, so it is persistent. If it isn't, you might want to do so, because then you can actually configure the running system through that volume, and it will be persistent. If you don't want to configure it at runtime, there are some people who say, no hot deploy, no runtime stuff. I will build it into my image and then it will restart. Then when I restart it, that configuration will be picked up. That's correct. But also, if you want to have it in a volume, then you can change at runtime just by placing files in there. Config names, config file names, I said, are relevant. We can export and download multiple config files in a zip archive. You can also zip it by yourself. File names are relevant, and config changes, if you make these configuration changes, they will automatically be distributed within a cluster. So that's quite a nice feature there. But we're going to discuss cluster in a bit. Now, well, quick session in here about Liferay Marketplace. If you need more applications, if you want more applications, especially if you want to just try out a little bit, you'll just find a lot of applications on Liferay's Marketplace. Why am I doing this? This is not an advertising section, but it leads us into the configuration for hot deploy. Marketplace is a place where you can find your applications, install them into the running system, and use them. What happens? You download something that is a module, an OSGI module, rather technical, or it is a WAR file, which is a classic web application, and you can deploy them to Liferay. And this is something that is worth knowing, especially now as we are on Docker. If you do so, make sure that your OSGI folder, there's always an OSGI folder in Liferay, is persistent in a volume, unless you specifically don't want it to. What you deploy, or when you deploy, you basically just drop components into Liferay's deploy folder. Now, this folder irritates some people because it's supposed to be empty. And as soon as you drop something there, Liferay will deploy the component that's in there and delete it from that folder. If that doesn't happen, deployment went wrong. So you got to debug that. Common reason is just file system permissions. With this Docker image, we are always running as the same user, so it's quite easy to fix this. With classic installations, where people started, well, trying out how do I bring Liferay on port 80, and they start Liferay as root. I've seen that happening more than once, that suddenly some of Liferay's files and folders have been owned by root, and as soon as you start as an unprivileged user again, they can't write to root's folders, they can't overwrite root's files, and fail. So just in case you're not running on this pristine and really nice and clean Docker image and container, then you might have those permission restrictions there or permission issues just with the directories, the files not being overwritable by the user that you are currently using. So you'll find deploy in Liferay Home. It's typically empty, and it should be empty as soon as you drop something in there a few seconds after, once it's deployed. Liferay will deploy to its own OSGI folder. You can disable hot deploy. There's a portal property here, auto.deploy.enabled. What is often changed, or more often changed than just the enabled, is the location of the folder. So where should it be? Where is my deploy folder? And the auto deploy interval, that's actually quite fine. This is not a performance drain. If Liferay checks every 3 seconds, if there is something, you won't realize that in terms of performance. I told you Liferay can deploy 2 types of application, a WAR file and a jar file. Now in the ancient past, up until Liferay 6.2, Liferay deployed all of its applications to the application server as a web application. It's a WAR file after all, so the web application server makes sense of the WAR files and deploys them as a regular web application. Now this was true until Liferay 6.2. This is no longer true since 7.0, so DXP 7.0, DXP 7.1, they do not deploy a WAR file to the application server anymore. However, what they do is they will bundle, they will wrap the web application into Liferay's own OSGI container, make an OSGI component out of it, and deploy it to the OSGI runtime system. Which means it doesn't really make a difference for you unless you are expecting the WAR file to appear within your application server's context. If you're looking at your Tomcat, at your JBoss, at your WebSphere, and you expect a new web application to show up, there's no use for that. It won't. Liferay will deploy it internally and just make sense of it on its own. If you deploy a jar file or several jar files, several OSGI modules, then Liferay will deploy them to its own OSGI subsystem anyways. After all, that's what OSGI is for. And hot deploy, by the way, in OSGI really works. The standard location for the OSGI container is also in Liferay Home. You might want to check if this needs to be an actual volume and persistent, or if you'd rather start clean whenever you start your container. That's your choice. You can deploy something there, or you can basically forbid to deploy something there. And again, you can change this location. For those of you who know more about OSGI already, there are several ways to bring code into the OSGI subsystem. And we have enabled GoGo shell, which is an OSGI shell interface in our Docker image. You might have seen this in portal properties or portal ext properties that we have configured. There's one setting in there that contains the number 11311. That is 11,311, which happens to be the port number on which GoGo shell listens. So you can connect to GoGo shell through Telnet and then issue commands into the OSGI runtime. Now this slide is headed or is titled file install, which means, I'm coming back from GoGo shell, whatever you put, I'll go back one slide, whatever you put into these OSGI folders, OSGI modules for example, will be picked up. The OSGI runtime monitors those folders, and whatever you drop there will be picked up by the OSGI runtime. Contrary to that, you can also use GoGo shell to just install random stuff from a URL on the web. However, it doesn't end in those OSGI modules folders. Now, my recommendation is you as DevOps people, as system administrators, to just use file install. So anything that ends up in those folders is great. Anything that doesn't end up there, for example, installations through GoGo Shell, are not great. Because what you deploy on one way must be undeployed the same way. You can't deploy one way and undeploy another way, it doesn't work. Or it does, well, it might work, but it might not be persistent. It might do different things than you expect. File install is the way that all of Liferay works. In other words, until you do something else, 100% of modules in Liferay are installed by file install. And that just makes it a no-brainer. If you need to choose one of the two options, this is the one to go. For development, it's nice to be able to use all of them. In a system administration class, I'd say, nah, choose one, that's repeatable, and that's what you actually want. You don't want ad hoc changes in your running system. You might need the access in order to debug, but you don't want the ad hoc changes in there. There's a few file install settings here, just as regular. We monitor the folders, or actually the OSGI runtime monitors the folders, so we have a poll interval, we have a log level, and we can immediately start new components that are in there, try to start them, and that's basically what you can do here. Now another review for this might be a little bit abstract, so I'll give you the hint what this actually stands for. I'll just advance to my cheat sheets. Liferay applications can be configured in several contexts. In the configuration section for an application, when it's added to a page, in the site level configuration interface, through system settings, via control panel, and via portal properties. Actually, not portal properties, you shall not change that, but portal ext properties. Liferay supports the installation of two major types of applications: modules. This refers to the OSGI modules, jars, bundles, as they are called, or WAR files. These are the classic web applications. And when Liferay's hot deploy mechanism picks up a module, it installs it in the OSGI container. The OSGI container is basically where every component in Liferay lives. So even though you do not need to have excessive knowledge about OSGI, you at least should know it's there, and Liferay uses it excessively. There are hundreds of modules, and if you deploy anything new to Liferay, that is where it goes to. On the development side, you should have a deeper knowledge of OSGI. On the system administration side, just know Liferay is a web application that starts its own OSGI container and then manages it, which might be against your expectation when you are working with a big iron web server, application server, because there you expect its administration console to be able to do everything. However, that administration console, let's say WebSphere application server, that console has no clue about Liferay's OSGI container, which means it can't manage it. That's as of here, as of you guys watching the videos or being here in the room, that's how much you must know about OSGI, especially if you're running with a full-blown application server and expect to fully 100% be able to use its administration console.